St. Louis people have a unique opportunity today to be Christian. Jesus said to love your enemies. Was he talking about the Cubs? You know, the Cubs going to the World Series has me wondering about the gospel reading this morning again, where Jesus says, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." And my question is, were the humble Cubs just exalted last night, or are they about to be humbled again in about a week or so? You just never know when Jesus' words will sort of come to fruition. Well, enough of that. The other day I was sitting at a stoplight, and the lady in front of me was obviously texting on her phone because she was looking down, and when the light changed to green, she didn't go forward, and she didn't move, and I tried to be patient. But when the light turned red again, I sort of lost it. She had still not moved, and I started shouting all kinds of bad words in the car, and I was beating on the horn and all this, and my expressions of distress were interrupted by a policeman who tapping on my window. And against my protestations of, "Well, you can't arrest me for hollering in my car," he ordered me into the back seat of his car. And after about 2 hours in a holding cell, the arresting officer advised me that I was free to go. And I angrily said to him, I said, "I knew you couldn't arrest me for yelling in my own car. You haven't heard the last of this." And the officer replied, "Well, I didn't arrest you for shouting in your car. I was directly behind you at that light, and I saw you screaming all those words and beating on your steering wheel, and I said to myself, what a jerk. But there's nothing I can do to him for throwing a fit in his own car. But then I noticed the cross hanging from your rear view mirror, the Jesus is coming soon bumper sticker, the fish symbol magnet on the back of your car, and the In God We Trust license plate." And I thought, this must be a stolen car. Didn't really happen. I didn't want you to think I'd really been incarcerated. In God we trust. Do we really? Or is that just a nice slogan that we like to put on our bumper stickers? The question is, who or what should we trust? When I was younger, and maybe some of you can relate to this, when I was younger, I was always told not to trust anyone over 30. Remember that? Well, now I don't trust anyone under 30. I don't know what's happened. I'm just kidding. But who or what should we trust? Obviously, it is important to put our trust in something or someone, or else we become just totally cynical about life. And you've all known those kind of people, right? Who just are cynical or negative about everything. Our trust has to be directed somewhere. We need to be trusting people. Now, as relatively prosperous Americans, many of us, of course, put our trust in money. So we use words such as trust funds and securities. We pay into Social Security, trusting that by the time we retired, maybe the government will have a check ready for us on a monthly basis. And even though our money says, "In God we trust," I've often wondered if the person who came up with that motto understood the irony of that. So I decided to look into it. And I learned this past week that the United States started printing the motto, "In God we trust," on our currency way back in the Civil War. Well, here's what happened. The Secretary of the Treasury was Salmon P. Chase, and he began to receive, during the Civil War, a lot of appeals from devout people all throughout the United States. Well, they weren't too united then, but you know what I mean. Who were concerned about the possibility that history would remember Americans as heathens. They were really worried about that. Now, I asked myself, although we're not in a civil war at this point, I wonder how history will remember us in light of the 2016 election. Heathen may not be a strong enough word, right? The question is, where do we place our trust? Wouldn't it be more honest for our money to say, in money we trust? I mean, why try to hide it? Shouldn't it say that? Now, besides money, there are other objects of our trust that are possibilities. For example, in order for our personal relationships with people to be good, you have to have some amount of trust that you put in your spouse, your partner, your friends, or so forth. And I think we feel like we need to be able to trust our neighbors, and many of us feel like we do, although most people continue to lock their doors day and night. If you belong to a church, it's probably a good thing if you're able to trust one another, trust the pastor, trust the trustees. That's a good word for that, right? And of course, we feel safer when we can trust our local law enforcement. If you're a soldier, I'm sure that you feel safer if you can trust your fellow soldiers. If your car breaks down, you want to be able to trust your mechanic. And of course, in every political season, we're asked to vote on the candidates we trust the most, or perhaps in some cases, the ones that we vote against the ones we trust the least, or however it turns out. But finally, our society would literally break down if there was absolutely no trust in our government, in the media, in the schools, the businesses, the healthcare institutions, and all of that. If there were no trust at all, society would break down. So we have to trust in someone or something just to get through the day. Now notice that in most of those examples I mentioned, we don't always have an easy choice about who to trust. It's not like we can easily choose, new political candidates or spouses or partners or friends or neighbors or fellow church members or police officers who pull you over for shouting obscenities, fellow soldiers, teammates. We can't just snap our fingers and remake all of our institutions, the government, the media, the schools, the businesses, healthcare providers, all that. It's not that easy. So trust might be a little too strong a word to use in some of those situations. At the very least, we do need a healthy dose of skepticism and caution as we place our confidence in people out there who make up our social, network. So at the end of the day, really, who can we trust? Well, is it ourselves? Is that who we can trust? So Jesus tells this parable that we've been talking about this morning, and he's attempting to answer the question, whom should we trust? Really, where should we direct our trust? In this parable, there's a Pharisee and there's a tax collector, and they go into the temple in Jerusalem to pray. And like many people involved in a spiritual quest, these two gentlemen are in pursuit of righteousness. Now, this is key. They're after righteousness. They want assurance that they are seen as righteous in the eyes of God. Now, that's it. Righteousness is an interesting thing. It's one of the goals of religion, but it's not the only goal of religion. But it has been important all throughout Christian history until maybe more kind of recently, relatively speaking, in Christianity. I think in recent times the traditional Christian focus on righteousness has begun to fade away a little bit, maybe just a little. For example, Florence Alshorn, who was an early 20th century English missionary, said, "Love is our adventure now, and not primarily righteousness." And I think many contemporary Christians are kind of going in that direction now, where the question is more about, how can I be more loving rather than how can I be more righteous? And I think the reason we're going in that direction is because we've learned the hard way that the latter, that is focusing on righteousness, will often slide into self-righteousness, which is not a good thing. Being righteous is good. Being good is what that means. Being self-righteous is a little tricky, right? So the Pharisee and the tax collector, we have to remember they're not contemporary Christians. They are first century Jews, and they are products of their religious environment. And so therefore, what they both want is assurance from God that they are righteous, because that was the most important thing in their religion. And yet that's where the similarity ends between these two men. The Pharisee, a religious professional who follows all the letters of the law, trusts himself, according to Jesus' parable. He trusts himself for righteousness. And he prays this interesting prayer. God, I thank you that I am not like other people. You know, those thieves, those rogues, adulterers, even this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week, and I give 1/10 of all my income. Well, obviously, this prayer is an indication that this guy, he is seeking God's stamp of approval for what he has done. Now, on the other hand, the tax collector is a man who in that day was considered among the worst of sinners. You know, the Bible, the gospel writers often talk about the tax collectors and sinners. Like tax collectors were a special category of sinners. And mainly because they were considered to be traitors to their people. They are working for the Roman government. And they're working for the oppressor, which would make them traitors. So this man understands clearly that he cannot trust himself. There's no way he's going to earn, God's stamp of approval for his righteousness. Instead, he trusts God for his righteousness. His prayer is simple and to the point. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. So he realizes that the closest he will ever come to being a righteous person is to be a forgiving person. And what I like about this parable is that it clearly, maybe even simplistically, points out the two primary choices we have concerning trust. We can trust ourselves, or we can trust God. The Pharisee trusted in himself, and the tax collector trusted in God. Now, although the Pharisee trusted in himself, which is not always a bad thing, it was for the wrong reason. He trusted in himself for righteousness. And it is true that we should trust ourselves to do the right thing and to be able to criticize ourselves when we do the wrong thing. That we should have that level of awareness and consciousness. However, we should never jump to the conclusion that, I'm a righteous person. Self-righteousness is the result of misplaced trust in ourselves. I'll say that again. Self-righteousness is the result of misplaced trust in ourselves. The tax collector had it right when he trusted in God for his righteousness. So trusting in God, is a very consistent theme all throughout our tradition. The prophet Jeremiah said, "Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord." Teresa of Avila, who was a 16th century Spanish mystic, said, "God is full of compassion and never fails those who are afflicted and despised if they trust in God alone." And H. Richard Niebuhr, who is a product of our tradition, the Evangelical Synod tradition, which is a predecessor body of the United Church of Christ, he talked about our absolute dependence on God and absolute trust in God with, this is interesting, with the consequent ability to move mountains. So the witness of our faith tradition is that our ultimate trust should be in God, as hard as that might sound. Not in ourselves, not in other people, not in institutions, certainly not our money, but in God alone. And perhaps this is why we stamp "In God We Trust" on our money, to remind us every day when we pull those bills out of the wallet that we shouldn't put our ultimate trust in something that is vulnerable to the whims of the stock market. Amen.